You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Campus podcast. I'm Miranda Prynne, Campus Editor.
And I'm Eliza Compton, the Deputy Editor of Campus.
And today we are talking about research, which is really the beating heart of higher education. And it brings a value that reaches far, far beyond academia. Research is a driving force behind greater knowledge and understanding about the world. So it's really what propels human progress in many ways. And at the most immediate level, for academics and institutions, it is what largely defines their success. It demonstrates their expertise and value. It qualifies them for funding. It ranks them against their competitors. So the question of what contributes to research excellence is a vital one for university leaders to consider. And our first interview, of which more shortly, explores this. But while quality research brings huge benefits to the institutions and individuals behind it, it also brings risk, as anything of value is, of course, subject to potential misuse. So, while the university laboratory or library may seem a long way from the world of high politics, as we'll hear shortly, research can be a highly valued weapon in global power struggles, and is therefore integral to questions of national security and economics and even political and social influence. Now, Eliza, you chose to focus on these sometimes overlooked aspects of research. So can you tell us who you spoke to and why?
Yes, absolutely. And this was an area that I didn't know very much about at all. So I was really interested to learn about how institutions and academics keep their work and indeed themselves secure from misuse, misinterpretation or misappropriation, as you've said, Miranda, which can occur when you have really valuable outputs. So I spoke to Jacqueline Littlewood, who has worked in research security from both sides of the fence, from an institutional point of view, but also from the point of view of intelligence and advisory roles. She is the Director of Research Security at the University of Alberta in Canada, and she leads the university's Safeguarding Research Office. And as is often the way with people who are very well versed in their areas of expertise, she was able to explain to me quite clearly what research security is, what is at stake when you are thinking about how you're going to keep your work secure, and its implications in a clear and practical way.
Yes, an interesting time to be working in research security, given the major sort of shifts in global power dynamics that are currently taking place. I guess, knowledge is power, right? Especially in a digital age where information can reach millions upon millions of eyes in a matter of seconds. So the way that information is used, presented, interpreted is becoming an ever more critical factor in government and other powerful bodies' arsenals.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jacqueline was able to give some advice that holds true regardless of the political climate. So pretty evergreen best practice.
Which is always useful. That's what we're all about here on campus. But before we delve into the murky world of research security, let's consider what makes research excel in the first place. So Marcus Munafo, who I spoke to, is currently Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research Culture and a Professor of Biological Psychology at the University of Bristol. But he will, in a few weeks, take up the new post of Deputy Vice Chancellor and Provost at the University of Bath. Marcus has a long-standing interest in driving up research quality, and this led to his co-founding of the UK Reproducibility Network, which essentially seeks to advance best practice in research. In this conversation, we discuss definitions of research excellence, how institutions can support it, why open research can improve research quality, and collaboration versus competition as drivers of great work. So let's hear from Marcus. Hi Marcus, great to talk to you today.
Hi, good to talk to you too.
Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of research excellence, I just wanted to congratulate you on a new role. You were recently announced as the next Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at the University of Bath, taking up the role in May. So, huge congratulations. How are you feeling about it?
Thank you. It's a really exciting opportunity and it's a great university to be moving to, and one that I know reasonably well, having just been down the road for the last 20 years or so. It's slightly terrifying because it's a big job and it's an important job, but it's mostly very exciting. And I think it's going to be an opportunity to really serve a university hopefully well and help it to navigate all of the challenges that the sector's facing at the moment. So I'm looking forward to it.
I think most people agree that the scariest roles are normally the most gratifying. So that's possibly a good sign.
I think so.
But that's not actually what we're here to talk about today. We are here to discuss research excellence. Now, this is a term used a lot in UK higher education, in part due to the Research Excellence Framework, or REF, by which the value of institutions' research output is judged. But it's also a term that describes what academics working in universities the world over aspire to achieve. So, given the different ways research excellence can be used or interpreted, what does it mean for you? Are there different meanings for different contexts?
Well, there are certainly different meanings, and also, I think, for different people. It's a really good question to ask. It's one of those things that we, I think, sometimes assume we understand or know what it refers to, but actually when you start to scratch the surface, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So I would say that research excellence is to do with research that is done for the right reasons and done well so that it can advance knowledge or benefit society or both. And I think the challenge is that excellent research is not necessarily the same as what some people sometimes take it to mean, which is, for example, groundbreaking research that pushes the boundaries. There's certainly a need for that. But as Jacqueline Littlewood says at UKRI, if all you do is groundbreaking work, then all you're left with is holes in the ground. That metaphor comes from the fact that we break ground in order to build something. And actually, the work that we do that builds knowledge on top of those foundational findings that push the boundaries of knowledge is just as important, ultimately. So I think we need to have a balanced view of what counts as research excellence. We need to take everything in the round, if you like, and understand that if we solely focus on the high risk, high return, groundbreaking work at the expense of that other work that needs to build on top of that, then we could find ourselves in a difficult position. So the research excellence framework, for example, I think is fundamentally about accountability for public money and deciding where to invest that public money for maximal benefit to society, and recognizing that part of what constitutes research excellence is that groundbreaking work is fine, but how else can we ensure that the environment within which that work is happening is sufficiently high performance that that groundbreaking work is going to be situated within a wider research ecosystem that makes sure that that knowledge is robust, that the questions that we're asking are important questions that need asking, that are going to advance knowledge, that are going to benefit society, and how can we ensure that that then translates to that downstream benefit over time?
Yes, so really you need a very rich and varied picture of research that can be deemed excellent in order to advance knowledge in every sense. And I can see, I mean, this is a message really for funders, for publishers, for universities, because presumably this is where the incentives become really important in terms of how others define research excellence.
That's right. And I think the thing to remember is that whilst it's fine for an exercise like the REF, for example, to focus when it comes to research outputs on that groundbreaking work, for example, it's also important to evaluate the wider environment with which that research takes place and ensuring that that is a high performance environment that's going to generate the best quality research of all the different kinds. And that's why I think the greater emphasis on what is called people, culture and environment in the next ref is actually really important. I think that's been deeply misunderstood in some quarters to just mean EDI, for example, and that's an important facet of a healthy environment, certainly, but it's only a small part of what it takes to have and to create and to sustain that kind of high performance environment that's going to generate both the groundbreaking research, but also the work that comes after to build on that foundation and to generate the downstream impact.
Yes, it's essentially laying the strong foundations that you need for everything else to then emanate from that, which does bring us on quite nicely to the UK Reproducibility Network. Now, this is something you co-founded in 2019, am I right?
That's right. I mean, there was a long period of lobbying and cajoling researchers, institutions, funders, and more to get to that point. But the actual launch was in March 2019.
Yeah, so I'm keen to find out, firstly, why you felt it necessary to build what is now a big, very well-known network, and how you have, over that time, really advanced its mission so that it has become a kind of household name in academic circles.
I mean, I hope that it has, because we are keen to work across and for the sector. And many people were involved in founding it, too many to list in one go, but it certainly wasn't the effort of any one individual. It came from a growing consensus that we could probably do better in terms of the quality of the research that we produce. It started in the biomedical space, and that's still where our center of mass is, if you like, but we are trying very hard to broaden out and to be relevant across disciplines. But since at least 2005, there'd been this growing debate around the extent to which research findings were robust and whether or not we could do better, and if so, whether or not we could, by creating more robust evidence, more rapidly advance knowledge and benefit society. And so it was launched really to capture that grassroots energy, because much of that conversation was happening amongst researchers and research enablers, technicians, librarians, and so on themselves. And we held a meeting in 2018 in Bristol where we brought together funders, publishers, learned societies, the other sectoral bodies that were interested in this. And the problem from the perspective of funders was that it was not seen as an issue that was uniquely within the remit of any single funder. It was a problem that required collective action to address. And we effectively offered ourselves as a group of engaged researchers and research enablers who were willing to take that challenge on. And so we created the network to have three main parts. We have local networks that are informal self-organizing groups of, again, researchers and research enablers that come together to run journal clubs and seminar series and form communities of practice around research improvement. We have those at about 80 institutions across the UK at the moment. Then we have institutional members. So those are institutions that have created a senior academic role to focus on research improvement at that senior level through hiring and promotion criteria, incentives, training, and so on at the institutional level. And then we have a group of stakeholders, the funders, the publishers, and the learned societies. And what that structure allows us to do is to coordinate and collaborate both within and between those different elements. So our different local network leads, for example, come together once a year to share ideas and practice. So do our institutional leads. We're also working on, for example, harmonizing promotion criteria across institutions so that what benefits your career at one institution is consistent with what benefits your career at another institution when you move on. And we are fostering collaborations between funders and publishers to incentivize particular ways of working that we think can help to improve research quality. So that's the basic structure. And what's been particularly gratifying is, as well as the UK network growing, we've seen reproducibility networks launch in other countries and regions. We have an African reproducibility network, which is the regional one. I've just come back from Ukraine. They've launched their own reproducibility network. And so we have those at 20 or so countries and regions now, allowing for that supranational coordination and collaboration as well.
So how do the quality checks that are applied to research impact the culture and the norms in how it is practiced?
So I think this is a really interesting question. At the moment, across most disciplines, the quality control checks that we have are through peer review. And that peer review happens at the end of the research process, where we have
a journal article, a monograph, whatever it might be, and that is reviewed by our peers and criticized, critiqued, and improved on the basis of that. But of course, the research has already happened, so the improvements can only be relatively superficial. There's an analogy that I like to use, which is the transformation that happened in the 1970s around the automobile industry. At that time, particularly in the US, there was a focus on productivity, but the quality control happened at the end of the production process. Someone would count the number of wheels on a car and check that the engine started, and that was pretty much it. And the statistician, W. Edwards Deming, took the concept of quality control throughout the manufacturing process to the Japanese automobile industry. The idea would be that you would run spot checks throughout the process as part of an ongoing process of self-evaluation, effectively. That meant that errors could be detected early. Where the errors occurred in the process could be detected, rather than having to reverse engineer that from a car that was badly built at the end of the process. And that approach not only transformed the quality of cars produced by the Japanese automobile industry, they still have a reputation for reliability today. They exported that approach to the rest of the world, and now all manufacturers use something similar. But that focus on quality not only improved quality, it also improved productivity, because you could identify errors more quickly, correct them more quickly. You didn't have to expend as much resource on identifying where the errors occurred, reverse engineering those from the end product, if you like. So if the analogy holds, we should be shifting the focus of our quality controls onto the process of research. And I think transparency in how we do research, open research principles, allow for that scrutiny, allow for that error detection, should drive up quality, but also serve as an incentive for us to get our processes right in the first place, but because it's better for us to detect our own errors than for someone else to detect our errors. And if the analogy continues to hold, not only will that improve the quality of the work that we produce, but it will also accelerate the rate at which that knowledge that we generate can benefit society, can advance knowledge, can lead to new treatments or whatever it might be, because the work that we're producing is high quality in the first place, and we don't end up going down so many blind alleys because it turns out that actually an initial finding was not robust.
Yeah, and what structural changes need to take place, though, to help make what you've described happen?
Well, I think focusing on open research practices is one part of it, making as much of the research process as available to scrutiny as possible, as appropriate, not just the end product, but the study protocols, the materials that we use throughout our scholarly process, the data or other source materials that we might be using, the methods that we apply to those, making all of those different individual elements available for scrutiny as early as possible in the process, I think can contribute to this. But there's a more general point, which is that I think as institutions, as well as individuals, as well as research groups, we should be thinking about how we can embed a cycle of continual improvement into how we work, not just in relation to research, but in relation to how we work more generally, so that we are constantly evaluating ourselves, turning our scholarly tools onto ourselves to understand how we work as researchers, to understand how we work as organizations, to implement different approaches to innovate, and then to evaluate whether or not those have the impact that we want.
Yes, and given the challenges that higher education in the UK and many other countries in the world right now are facing, I mean, this feels like a time where everything is being shaken up and everything is up for grabs. So this need to really turn the reflection, or for universities, academics to turn reflection in upon their own work, seems particularly pertinent. You mentioned promotion criteria and joining those up so that institutions will reward the same things being achieved, which shines a light upon maybe a wider theme that I hear talked about a lot, which is just that greater collaboration would be hugely helpful in advancing research excellence, and that the inherent competition between researchers and between institutions is not always helpful. Do you think that's true?
I think that's very much true. And the ethos of, I guess, myself personally, but also more importantly, UKRN is very much collaborative. And our primary focus at the moment is on open research, transparency in the research process as a means by which we can drive up quality, because it allows for more scrutiny, more error detection, and therefore higher quality research. But to get people to work in those ways, we need to provide training, we need to provide incentives. And I think there are opportunities to do that in a way that is collaborative, is more effective, and creates cost savings, all of which are important in the current climate. So at an institutional level, for example, we are looking at how we can include open research practices in promotion criteria in order to incentivize those, but again, do that in a way that is consistent across institutions so that that incentive exists wherever you move on to in your career. But we're also offering train the trainer courses on open research practices that are delivered centrally. Institutions can send representative trainers onto those courses. They then go back to their host institutions to deliver workshops. That's more cost effective because the fixed costs are shared effectively across those participating institutions. But more importantly, perhaps it also creates consistency of training across those participating institutions, because whilst the workshops can be tailored to the host audience at any given institution, and we have a very diverse range of institutions in the mix in UKRN, they all share some common DNA because they all come from the same train the trainer courses. So again, when researchers move from one institution to another, there is some commonality in how things are done in those different institutions that reduces friction. So more effective and more cost effective.
And will make it easier for people between institutions to work together, one would assume. This point of collaboration, one can't talk about this without talking about the research excellence framework, which does pit institutions against each other in one sense, because everyone is fundamentally competing for a slice of a finite pie of funding by demonstrating that they have the research that is most worthy of support. So do you see the REF as being aligned to the UK reproducibility network, or is it kind of in conflict?
I think that's a really big question. And I don't want to spend hours and hours pontificating, but I guess REF, it's important to recognize that REF is an accountability mechanism for public money, and there needs to be some mechanism by which where that money is allocated is decided. So I see the need for something like a REF. I do think it has become more and more complicated over time, but the extent to which it creates competition, I mean, in that it's zero sum, the amount of funding available is finite, and institutions get a slice of that by virtue of how they perform in that REF process. But equally, to some extent, I think we as academics, as institutions, do this to ourselves by buying in perhaps too heavily to that competitive narrative. One could argue that focusing on doing things well within our own institutions should mean that we do well in the REF, but also should mean that we then generate investment from outside of that closed system that the REF represents. So I don't think it's necessarily either or. I think if you do the sorts of things that benefit you as an institution by focusing on that high performance environment that I talked about, which is necessarily upstream of the research that takes place in that environment, and in turn the impact that flows from the research that you do, if you can get that environment right and create a vibrant place where people can do the best quality research, can thrive in terms of their own careers, can feel supported and nurtured and so on, then yes, you'll do well in the REF because you will have that strong environment, you will have strong outputs, those outputs will generate impact, but you will also do well generally in terms of, for example, attracting investment from industry because you're a good place to work, you're a good place to invest in. Perhaps pull back slightly from that competitive narrative to mutual benefit.
That is also contingent then on being able to demonstrate all of those things that you're doing within the research ecosystem upstream of perhaps the major groundbreaking findings. So how do you think the redirected focus, you've mentioned already the people, culture and environment focus that REF is kind of steadily producing more details on, and there is also an ongoing kind of greater and greater focus on demonstrating impact in inverted commas. How do you think these might affect research in the UK?
Well, I think the opportunity that this creates is for us to apply the skills, the academic skills, the research skills that exist within the sector to how we work ourselves. And one of the ironies is that we have all of this outstanding research talent and research excellence within the sector, but we relatively rarely apply those skills, methodologies to understanding how we work ourselves as institutions and how we can do things better. So any number of commercial organizations, for example, will routinely run A/B tests of different ways of doing things, different internal processes, and so on, and use that evidence to inform how they set themselves up as an organization. That's relatively uncommon in the UK. The extent to which we actually use research itself on ourselves to inform how we set ourselves up, how we run ourselves, to optimize our working processes to create that high performance environment. I think there's a real opportunity there that we're missing at the moment that we can also do collaboratively by, for example, working across a consortium of universities to try different ways of working and see which ones work best. If we can start to get into that mode, I think that again will create efficiencies in how we work, but also cost savings in terms of being more efficient, reducing workload, improving productivity, and so on.
Yes, and universities in the UK are facing huge financial challenges and other challenges, but the financial challenge filters down really through everything. So there is a massive need to start reassessing how things have always been done and really looking at what's going to work best, and be most efficient. So I can see that there's a strong argument for what you described there. Just sticking with this theme of continuous improvement, you were rowing coach for the Oxford University Women's Boat Club and then the Great Britain team for the under-23 lightweight women's double scull. I know you also served as an officer in the Army Reserve for 15 years. I just wondered how these fairly varied experiences have shaped your approach to academia.
I think it's always worth reflecting on how we can learn from other sectors, what we can learn from other sectors. And I've been lucky enough to have these other experiences outside of my academic career that I both very much enjoyed, but also which taught me a great deal about how things are done in those different contexts. And both of those, elite sport and the military, are high performance environments where there is a lot of skin in the game. In the context of elite sport, for example, you train for 4 years for a 6-minute race and it's, gold or not. And that means that people have put a great deal of themselves into getting to that point. And so the system, as much as possible, and these sectors are not without their flaws, I don't want to be too kind of rose tinted about it, but what they do is optimize to maximize performance, to be high performing environments that also ideally nurture and support the individuals within them, because of course one of the ways in which you achieve high performance is by supporting the individuals that contribute to that performance. So I think we can learn a lot from those, and it's interesting that now, for example, sporting federations within UK sport have to have a culture element to their individual strategies, because not only is that the right thing to do to make sure that you're creating an environment where people feel supported, nurtured and can thrive, but also self-interestedly, if you're able to retain your best talent, your athletes, say, over multiple Olympic cycles, then that's going to benefit you in terms of the success that you achieve, because you're not having to regenerate that talent because people are dropping off after a single Olympic cycle because it was just too much for them, for example. So I think one of the things that we can learn is this centrality of a positive environment, culture, to achieving that kind of high performance system that we want to create. And in the context of academic research, universities are in service of society. We are using public money to generate knowledge, to benefit society, to generate new treatments or whatever it might be. And to do that, we need to ensure that we have that kind of high performance environment that allows people to thrive, that allows people to pursue their interests, but to do so in a way that is going to maximally benefit society, to generate the most valuable knowledge and so on. So there's a lot that we can learn, I think, from different sectors, and those are just two examples. But what we need to be doing is then looking at how we can develop and adapt what is done in other sectors so that it works within academia and the unique culture of academia. And we need to be evaluating whether or not it works as intended, which goes back to that point about that cycle of continual improvement, collecting data on new things that we do and checking that they're actually having the intended consequences and not having any unintended consequences.
Yes, and if any group of people should be well equipped to carry out that process successfully, it should be those working in higher education. It should be academics and researchers.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's one of the ironies that perhaps, we don't do as much of this as we could and should, despite having all the tools available to us. And not just in a narrow sense. This can include qualitative research, ethnographic research, participant observers, as well as quantitative research, collecting metrics on outputs that are relevant to whatever intervention we are implementing to see whether or not it does improve our productivity, improve our effectiveness, and so on.
It's interesting that drawing on your experience in elite sport, because it's not an analogy I've ever particularly considered, but actually there is quite a good analogy with research there, because of course for a successful research environment, as you've described, you need this whole holistic view feeding in from the grassroots, a supportive environment, a positive environment, and to retain talent. But there's this huge amount of work happening on an ongoing basis. And yet it's that final outcome, that 6-minute race, that steals the headlines. And it is the same with research, that there's a huge amount of work that needs to be going on all the time. But for a lot of people in the general public sphere, what they might be most aware of is one major groundbreaking piece of research that emanates from it. And therefore it's very easy to focus on those outcomes, but actually they're not necessarily the most important part.
I think that's right. And one of the insights that came out of that work that I mentioned earlier, when Demings took the concept of quality control to the Japanese automobile industry, was the idea that if you get the process right, then the outcome will look after itself. And that's something that you hear all the time in elite sport: focus on the processes, trust the process, and is one of those things that we could perhaps bring into how we think about academic research. And I think it's also worth noting that those three different, superficially very different sectors that we briefly mentioned are fundamentally all about people. They all use technology and gadgets and so on, and they all have their own individual cultures and their strengths and weaknesses. And like I say, it's not like any one should be put up on a pedestal as the right way of doing things. But fundamentally, what unifies them, I think, is that they all are all about people. And if you can create an environment where the people that are in support of what you're trying to achieve can thrive, can feel nurtured, can achieve their maximum potential, and so on, then everything else will flow from that.
And finally, on an institutional level, perhaps with an eye on the role that you're about to take up, what does good research leadership look like?
I think leadership is a tricky word, because in academia we tend to conflate leadership and seniority and think of leadership as something that happens sort of above us, if you like. Whereas I see leadership as a behavior that any of us can express on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, through our Enhancing Research Culture allocation at Bristol, we've done a piece of work around leadership. We've developed a website called the Leadership Ethos website. It's just leadershipethos.org, and it's freely available to anyone across the sector. And it describes 7 key behaviors, things like doing the right thing, not the easy thing, as things that we can all bring to life in our day-to-day practice. So we can all demonstrate leadership, even if we're not necessarily in a senior position or what might be called a leadership position. And I think good research leadership is creating that culture of leadership at all levels, where everybody feels empowered and safe to spot an opportunity, take the initiative, and add value in whatever way they can at whatever level within the system they're operating at. So good leadership for me is about creating that culture rather than something specifically done from the top.
Yes, creating opportunities for people to reach their potential.
And to innovate and to take risks and to feel safe doing so, and to do so in a way that is aligned with the main effort of the institution and the mission of the university.
Yeah, brilliant. Look, thank you so much for speaking to me today, Marcus. Hugely appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, such a great interview, Miranda. Marcus is so interesting and points out that research is not necessarily about the groundbreaking discoveries or the boundary pushing that gets all the headlines, but is also about building on existing knowledge, and that it's really important for universities to provide a robust environment where high performance can really generate the best quality research, regardless of whether we even understand where the discoveries will end up.
That's always the argument for, pure research versus applied, isn't it? That you can't always predict the benefits that will emanate from simply creating new knowledge and new understanding.
Yeah, and really feeds into his support and championing of the necessity for reproducibility. I was also struck by what he said about the usefulness of peer review, which seemed to me kind of similar to the arguments against summative assessment, which is that the work has already been done. So it's kind of backwards thinking, and that perhaps, I think he used the analogy of the car industry, that perhaps continuous improvement processes would be a better way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the analogy with things like elite sport actually works so well.
Yes, and Marcus also underlined the importance of open practices and open research, which is something that Jacqueline Littlewood also picks up in my interview, and is one of the facets of her role. As you'll hear, she has led the Safeguarding Research Office since 2023. She also has a background in international relations and security, having spent almost a decade working within Canada's intelligence community. And in that context, she was responsible for stakeholder engagement with academia and contributed to the development of Canada's national security guidelines for research partnerships. So she brings all this knowledge to our conversation, which covers not only what her role entails, but where the responsibility for research security lies and where researchers can go for guidance and support if they're not sure about where to start safeguarding their research. Hi, Jacqueline, and welcome to the Campus Podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You are the Director of Research Security at the University of Alberta in Canada. And to start us off, I wondered if you could explain a bit what that role entails.
Absolutely. So as the Director of Research Security, I'm responsible for supporting our university community in understanding the complex landscape of research security, as well as navigating related federal and provincial Canadian government requirements on research security. And so to do that, I'm leading an office of 10 individuals at this point in time, a safeguarding research office. And we provide daily support to our research community. I also am the co-lead for a regional community of practice that helps to increase the resilience for research security regionally. And I also support some governance committees that we have here for research security at the University of Alberta.
A very diverse role by the sounds. For our listeners who are a bit like me and not very, very familiar with the term research security, can you just explain to us a bit about what it covers and what it is and perhaps what it isn't?
Yeah, for sure. So it's called research security here in Canada. In Europe, it's mostly referred to as research integrity. Which I think is an important definition because essentially it means all the actions that we are taking to protect researchers against threats to research security and research integrity. Primarily, we're referring here to foreign interference and espionage, state-directed threats. And for me, it's important to talk about safeguarding not only research, but researchers. So our role involves taking steps to ensure that researchers maintain the autonomy and control over their research so that it's not misappropriated. It's about ensuring that they decide when it's shared, with who it's shared, and for what purposes.
So many facets to it. What are the potential consequences of poor research security?
Yeah, for that, I would say the consequences, it's important to think about them at different levels. So for the individual researcher, we mostly see the consequences as being possible loss of their research, their data, their knowledge. It also can mean that they could have a negative impact on their reputation, their professional reputation. It could impact the career prospects that they have. If their research is stolen and they're not able to advance it, that could have really negative impacts for them as an individual. At the institutional level, there's that same possible reputational damage. In addition to things like possible financial repercussions, political risk, and even legal risk. So if, let's say, someone potentially violates requirements or sanctions in relation to research security, that could have a legal impact for the institution. And then if we think about things at the higher level nationally, we see that in the aggregate, the loss of this IP research innovation can really have a negative impact on national security, potentially contributing to another country's military program, for example, and economically. So it could impact a country's economic future.
Mm-mm. You work at an institutional level, but where do you see the responsibility for research security primarily lying? Does it have a focal point, or is it a shared aspect across individuals and institutions?
Yeah, here in Canada, the approach has been to see it as a distributed and shared responsibility, because I think each level in that that I've talked about previously of society recognizes that we can't do it alone, that it really does take sort of an integrated whole of society approach. So at the individual level, it's an individual level who knows their research best. They know, what it could be used for if it has dual use impacts. And they also know the partnerships that they're pursuing. So there really is an onus on them we always talk about know your research and know your partner. And so that's the level of responsibility that we see resting with the individual. At the institutional level, there is a responsibility to ensure awareness. So what are the requirements? What is the threat? And also in our case, we provide support on what's known as open source due diligence. So helping those researchers to understand better what some of the risks might be relating particularly to the partners or others that they are working with, collaborators, investors, those kind of things. And then nationally, obviously, they're responsible for national security, for setting policies, and ideally for resourcing where appropriate, and providing other tools, training, and those kind of things. So I should say that here in Canada, I think we are unique in that the Government of Canada has provided direct funding to universities to set up offices such as the one that we have here at the University of Alberta.
And you mentioned this sort of tension between open science and research security. We've done a little bit of work here in campus about open research and the importance of it. And it is, I have to say, one of the questions that often comes up. How do you balance this tension between open science and research security?
Yeah, I'm really happy that you brought that up. Here in Canada, the government, this has also been really important for them because open science is also a priority. And so the approach taken here is that research data knowledge should be as open as possible and as safeguarded as necessary. And I think what that really means in practice is a risk proportionate approach. So there can be a spectrum of openness, and that will depend on your unique circumstance. It could means looking at things like, for example, what is the sensitivity of the data? Is there an IP consideration? Are you holding Indigenous data, for example? And if so, do you have the consent for onward disclosure of that? You could also look at things like whether there's other ethical considerations at play. And one of the things that I think people maybe underestimate or don't understand about open science and open access is that these things can also have sort of a temporal aspect. So maybe initially when there's a greater risk, you don't share everything or you share only pieces of your research, but later on, when the risk is diminished, you could share more widely and more openly. So to me, there isn't necessarily a tension, and it's something that we're working hard to address with our research community, that they can do both, and it's important to do both.
That's really, really interesting. Makes me think about copyright issues, in fact. So when I was doing a bit of research and reading around the topic of research security, it seems that there's a lot of focus on science, on tech, engineering, healthcare. And I did wonder whether research security was very much a STEM consideration or whether it was also important for the social sciences and the humanities.
So I would say that it is definitely also important for the social sciences and humanities, but the way that the threat manifests in those areas is somewhat different. So when we talk to those in the social sciences and humanities, we focus more on what is the possible misappropriation or misuse of their research. And here we can think about things like use for disinformation, let's say for propaganda by a foreign adversary or regime, and possibly misinformation. So let's say if you were in the social sciences and your information was taken from you and misused and published perhaps out of context, that could be something that could, again, have a really negative impact on you and your career. And it's really hard to disabuse folks of that misinformation once it's out there. Another thing that we're seeing as well with the social sciences and humanities is that there's we try to approach and advance interdisciplinarity. So we see in some cases you could have a project, for example, that's primarily focused on dance, but perhaps there's an aspect of integrating artificial intelligence or virtual reality to that. And in those cases, we've seen cases where they could potentially be using those technologies for something called gait analysis. So yes, you're looking at the movements of the dancer, but what could a hostile state be using that same technology for? They might look at the movement of an individual from a completely different perspective and in uses and in ways that are completely antithetical to what the researcher initially had in mind.
And is that part of your role to perhaps think a bit more laterally as to the possible implications of work beyond its core scope?
So we have those conversations with our researchers, and sometimes it is something that hasn't really occurred to them that their research and their innovation could be used in those ways. So that is one of our roles, is to increase that awareness of the possible hostile applications or dual use applications of their research.
And do researchers really understand this? So do researchers, I guess, understand the need for research security?
I think that's really changing, Eliza. It's definitely different from when I first started having these conversations with researchers, let's say about 5 years ago. There is a growing appreciation of the fact that geopolitics isn't something that just happens outside of academia, that in fact it's having a direct impact on academia and on researchers. And they're starting to appreciate that this is a competency that they're going to need to succeed and to protect their own innovation and research futures. So we're seeing sort of a growing, I guess, buy-in, if you will, and engagement. And one thing that we definitely have found, we're fortunate in that we are able to provide these supports to their researchers. And so once we've helped them, let's say once with a project in identifying, assessing, and mitigating risks, the next time that they are putting in a research proposal, they're much better positioned to understand those things themselves. And they start to, it's almost like a lens that you apply. Once you start to see the world in that way and you get to understand what the risks are, it's hard to unsee it. Which can be positive and negative, I guess.
Yeah. And where do researchers go to find this kinds of information or guidance? I imagine there's national guidelines, but are there other places that are useful to check or to consider?
Yeah, well, I would definitely say that we've found a huge range of resources available online. So within Canada, but also our allies. Another really useful source of information that I would recommend to institutions that perhaps, they're smaller or they don't have the resources to have their own office is to look at setting up their own sort of community of practice, whether that be really locally or regionally, because there is no sort of need to reinvent the wheel. You can look at what others have done, the resources that they have developed, and then adapt those to your own situation. Another thing that we've looked at also is the resources coming out of the G7 and the OECD. So internationally, some resources have been developed, and this includes things like, guidance, tools, things like that. And then I'm also seeing an increase in the number of sort of different modes or media that are out there. So we have a newsletter, for example, that anyone is able to subscribe to. It's called the Research Security Review. There's also journal articles increasingly, and we even have as well a podcast, the Power Plant Sessions, that anyone can tune into. So depending on where you are in your research security journey or which medium you prefer, there's definitely a wealth of resources out there now.
Are there, broadly speaking, points or areas that researchers should be particularly considering? So I guess it's a potted points of best practice to make sure practices are sound and secure.
Yeah, from that, I would really come back to, again, the whole two core principles being know your research and know your partner. And then within that, learning to identify, assess, and mitigate risk, because there's never going to be no risk. So we want folks to really appreciate just taking a risk proportionate approach. And once you're able to identify where the risks are, some key elements that we always recommend in terms of mitigating the risks, which researchers can learn, is training, cyber security, physical security, having a research data management plan, looking at your agreements that you might conclude and making sure that there's a reciprocity there, that you have some means for dispute resolution in a jurisdiction in which you could pursue that, and thinking about what kinds of measures you need to put in place for IP protection if that's relevant. So there are some sort of core repeatable activities that a researcher can undertake as a best practice.
And is there a life cycle of research security? So in terms of where it begins and ends, is there an end point when you're thinking about these things?
I'm not sure there's an end point, but we recommend that folks reach out to us sort of as soon as they can, like at that project inception stage, because then we can, again, we talked about that lens, so they could start to look at their project with that lens right from the very beginning and use that to guide them in terms of, well, who will I partner with on this, and are they a trusted partner? And then they could think about things like, what kinds of research outcomes am I expecting? What might I need to consider in terms of how I will safeguard that research as my project evolves? So we like to think about it. There's a couple points that we sort of intersect with the research life cycle, that early stage of inception, then the stage at which they're usually applying for the funding. We talk to them about making sure they have a really solid plan in place. And then when the funding is awarded, that's another time that we reach out to make sure that they have all the support they need to, for example, let's say they had in their plan that they were going to have a research data management plan to protect their data. So then we reach out to them and make sure that they have such a plan in place, or we connect them with the right resources. And then ultimately, let's say you're going to archive your research or you're going to publish it, we can have those conversations again at that point about making sure that you've considered research security and ultimately determining, sort of the final stages of that research project.
So really an end-to-end consideration. You mentioned risk mitigation, and I wanted to ask about the implications of politics when the political landscape is an ever-changing thing. And so how much of that comes into considerations for research security?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're here in Canada at a really interesting point in history, but I'm starting to get some questions about, in this new landscape, who are the trusted partners? But I think that the kinds of principles and behaviors that I talked about previously will stand a researcher in good stead regardless of those changing geopolitical winds. So regardless of who your partner is, you're going to look at, is this a partner that I can trust? Does it seem like our interests are aligned? I talked earlier about having dispute resolution mechanisms in a jurisdiction that you feel you could pursue those that dispute. So as let's say a country changes its legal landscape, if you're concerned that the government might step in and require a researcher, for example, to hand over their research, that's something you would want to consider before you concluded a research agreement, regardless of which country your collaborator was in. So I think that the principles and the behaviors that we're advocating, they will stand the test of time, regardless of how our ally of the day might shift.
Fascinating. You have moved over from policy making into working for a higher education institution. So for a final question, what have you learned about implementing safeguards within higher education that is different from, or perhaps surprising from, the other side of the fence?
Yeah, so I was in government for about 20 years, most of that in a sort of a policy making role. And I would say that I definitely did not appreciate, I think, the decentralized nature of academia. That's been what I've found sort of the greatest challenge thus far in terms of implementing research security policy here, is that it's very difficult in an academic environment where there is no sort of central control or oversight or ability to enforce that policy, which means that we've had to do a lot of sort of winning hearts and minds here as a way to bring folks on board with research security, rather than any kind of a hierarchical top-down approach that I might have seen within the government itself.
Well, Jacqueline, thank you so much. I've learned a great deal from this conversation. I have to say, it's been illuminating. So thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure, Eliza.
Lots of food for thought there. It shows there's actually no easy answer to that question of how to balance open research practices with research security. As Jacqueline intimated, it really has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And it feels like the important thing is that institutions do have teams of experts like Jacqueline in place to help researchers consider these questions, because, you know, something like the potential hostile uses of their work, I think in many cases that's probably very far from obvious. And as a researcher, there is a risk that in your pursuit of uncovering knowledge on a particular issue, you could become quite tunnel visioned and, you know, very focused on a specific challenge from a specific perspective, and almost lack that broader view that someone one step removed can take in order to then see how it might be applied elsewhere, and thus what risks it poses, and therefore how to protect it.
Yeah, the surprising example there was considering whether research in dance could produce capabilities to analyse gait, which then had surveillance or security implications. And speaking to Jacqueline, it really did make me think that when research outputs can be really valuable IP, or you're working in a potentially changeable political situation, that thinking about research security is really something that should be embedded in all research proposals at many important steps along the way. So when you're putting the question together, when you're applying for funding, when you're thinking about how the project will actually be published and shared, all these points require expertise like Jacqueline's.
Yeah, and I suspect that researchers may come under increased pressure to consider that at the offset and through each stage due to, let's face it, greater political expediency.
Yeah, absolutely. And really thinking about how these things can be shared and interpreted once they're out in the wider world. Well, that is the end of our episode today about research excellence. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please like and subscribe. If you are interested in more practical advice and insight from academic experts from around the world, please visit campus. We are at timeshighereducation.com/campus. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.